The weather so far this year has been really weird. We had snow in March, and then we had a cold, long, wet spring, and then suddenly it was warm and dry with a heat wave thrown in. Since March, the weather here in Ireland has been quite similar to what I grew up with in Canada. It's not bad weather, it's actually quite good weather to grow in and quite enjoyable, but it's just different and unexpected, and that has caused some problems. Ireland is famous for its wet, cool maritime climate. It's what makes everything so green. But for the past 7 weeks, since the middle of May, the temperatures most days have been significantly above normal, with a break of about 10 days where there was more normal temperatures. And there was a few days where the temperatures almost broke record all-time highs, with temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius. I don't ever remember feeling heat like that in the 20 years I've lived in Ireland. The rainfall during the same period of time has also been very low. In May, June and July of a typical year, we would expect on average of about 17 to 20 millimeters of rain each week. But for the last 7 weeks, we've only received 25 millimeters of rain in total. Put another way, there's more than 100 millimeters of rain that we would normally get over that period of time that hasn't fallen. And we haven't had a drop of rain in the last 26 days. It looks like there might be some rain tomorrow, but it doesn't look like there's going to be a lot. With all of the warm temperatures and lots of sunlight and big thirsty plants in the ground, the time that we need the most water is when we've actually had the least. This is quite an unusual drought for Ireland, and a lot of growers and farmers are really suffering, and so is the landscape and biodiversity around us. Within the context of many parts of the world, this is quite normal and in fact good growing conditions. But here in Ireland we're struggling because it's outside of the range of what we've come to expect. And that's a critical point, having to deal with things that we're not set up for, and it can be quite chaotic and stressful having to deal with unexpected pressures just when our workload is tough enough. And this is especially an issue when our systems aren't as resilient as they could be. There was a fair amount of heat stress in plants in the polytunnel, especially during the really hot days. And there was also heat stress in some of the plants outside, particularly the salad crops. And it was difficult to keep enough water in the potted plants, and seed germination was a bit tricky for some crops. Other plants did really well during that period, especially the squash, courgettes or zucchini, and the runner beans, which really like these type of conditions, providing I can keep enough water in the soil. But it was all a bit much as a grower, with the heat and the sun being quite overwhelming at times, especially in the polytunnel, and I really feel for farm workers around the world who have to deal with these kind of conditions on a regular basis. This kind of heat in a garden is okay and even desirable, but water is a key issue, and it's especially an issue for me in this site because of key limitations of the context that I'm in. The municipal water supply has very low flow and pressure, the result of poor coordination and planning during the development phase of this community. There's obviously some kind of obstruction in the supply pipe, and the result of which is we only get about 8 liters a minute of water on the site, less if more people are using the supply. This is a fixable problem, but not without digging up the entrance road and laying a whole new section of pipe. In a typical year, this constraint has not been a problem. It does add a little bit of extra work in the polytunnel, but not enough to really worry about, and as a result, the problem never got fixed. But this season, it's been a real problem with trying to get enough water in the gardens, as it slows everything down and it really limits the options, as many sprinklers just don't work with this kind of low pressure. I've explored a number of different options on how best to do this, but without rushing out and setting up drip line watering systems for all of the gardens, I can only really water by hand. Thankfully, I have a number of large tanks that have been really helpful with this. So what I've been doing is setting up the tanks near the garden that needs to be watered, letting them slowly fill up over time, and then watering quickly by hand using watering cans. It takes me about 20 minutes to add over 600 liters of water to a 100 square meter garden, which equates to about 6 millimeters of rain if it's spread out evenly over the whole area. I've also started using hoses or pipes to siphon water from one tank to the next, which means that I can fill up 3 tanks at a time, which saves time in managing the whole process, and it also means that I can stockpile water when other people aren't using the supply, and I can water the gardens when it's most convenient for me. But it's still taking up a lot of my time as I'm trying to water each of the 6 outside gardens at least twice a week, in addition to the regular watering that I need to do in the polytunnel. This means that I've been spending about 7 hours a week watering all the gardens, or about 1 hour a week for each of the family scale gardens outside. In comparison, last year I spent on average only 4 hours over the entire season watering each of these gardens. And most of this was to keep recently sown seed beds moist, or to help transplants, or while liquid feeding. I've added more water in the last 3 weeks to each of these gardens than I would normally add over an entire growing season. Of course, all of this has an impact as I don't really have time for a lot of the other tasks, and it's already been an extra busy season. As a result, I'm struggling to keep up with some of the sowings that I've planned, and I've delayed sowing some crops that would need some extra care and attention, and I've abandoned others. In addition, some of the plants that have been growing in the garden are maturing faster than expected or bolting, and I don't have transplants ready to fill the space when they're pulled out. And it's a bit disconcerting seeing empty beds in the garden in the middle of the summer. I've been practicing a type of triage, letting go of some crops and focusing on the crops that will do a lot better with some care and attention, and trying to fit everything else in when I have the time. It could be a really good growing season, especially for the crops that I can keep strong and healthy with enough water and fertility. It might be the best crop of squash that I've ever grown, which is a plant that I normally have a lot of trouble growing in this climate. In addition to keeping up with day-to-day tasks, I've also been looking at how things can be made easier in the future, and replacing the pipe for the municipal water supply is a big part of this. I've also been exploring options for installing a pump and pipes to bring water from another well, which is about 400 meters away from the gardens. This will reduce dependency on the municipal water supply, which is treated and can be expensive and could be restricted at some point in the future. Then, with decent water pressure and supply, I could invest in sprinkler systems and even lay out drip line watering systems in all the gardens outside. Catching rainfall water would be an option, but there's an issue about how much can be realistically stored and for how long. I could also work to build the soil organic matter and apply mulches and use a lot of other techniques that are useful in growing in dry climates, which often don't make a lot of sense here in Ireland. I could also invest in shade cloths to protect seedlings and transplants from the strong sun and heat, and I could even put in ventilation fans into the polytunnel. But all of this is infrastructure with associated costs and embedded energy and equipment that needs to be maintained and materials that need to be stored, and it only really makes sense for me to acquire this stuff if I think I'm going to need it again, and it's kind of crazy to think that I would use any of this stuff in Ireland. So, getting the water pipe replaced makes a lot of sense for a number of different reasons, but everything else depends on the likelihood of these dry conditions happening again in the near future. If I believe that the climate was broadly stable or changing only very slowly, then I might deduce that these extreme conditions are only at the outer edge of what would be considered a normal range, and therefore unlikely to happen again for a number of years or decades. In which case it doesn't make a lot of sense to make these kinds of investments or changes, as I would assume that the weather next year and the year after that would be closer to the normal range. But that's not what I believe, as I trust the climate science for the most part, and believe that the climate is shifting and possibly faster than the climate models have forecasted. And some of these models have indicated that we should expect more of the types of weather that we've already experienced this year, with wet, stormy winters and dry summers. In which case, I should expect that these hot, dry conditions will happen more frequently in the near future, and I should start investing in the infrastructure and start planning for the possibilities that these unusual growing conditions may actually become typical or normal. But of course, there's no guarantee, as seasonal weather is very different from long-term climate trends averaged over many years. And next year, we might have a cool growing season with way too much rain. This Red Gardens project is an independent, citizen-led research and development project focused on trying to help people to grow more food for themselves and others. The only funding I get is through the sale of surplus vegetables to my neighbors, teaching an occasional course, but mainly through this YouTube channel. As I want to avoid sponsorship and would prefer to limit ads as much as I can, I've set up a Patreon page to try to raise funds from people around the world who want to support me in the work that I do, or at least want to encourage me to produce more videos. A link to my Patreon page can be found here or in the description below, and I've produced a short video explaining how Patreon works and why I've chosen it as a platform, which you can find here or again in the description below. It would be really cool if you could support me in this great adventure, but most importantly, thanks for watching.